Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you for joining us for one of our talks today. Today, we're so lucky to be joined by the fantastic team behind the movie Rollers. We have actors Johnny Ray Gill, Kevin Bigley, and Kate Cobb, as well as writer-director Isaiah Smallman. And Isaiah, I wanted to start with a question for you because this whole film takes place around the central idea of this club Rollers, which means so much to the central character Rufus, but also actually really ties all of the characters in the movie together. And the way that you've constructed it in the film, it doesn't just give us such a sense of the history, but there's also such clear specificity in the visual aesthetics, even down to the costumes and the outfits that people wear that are branded with the club on it. And so I wanted to just ask you about your journey, even when you were working on the script early on, how you started to think about so many of the tiny, minute details in order to pull together what we ultimately see visually on screen and emotionally through the club.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thanks for having us. Pleasure to speak with you about it. I, I'm glad you noticed all the details because that's one of those things where, as a director, sometimes you start to think. I mean, all of everybody else here has directed stuff too, and it's like I think it's pretty common as a director. I'm like, am I wasting my time with this? Like, is anyone even going to notice all of these things? So it's good to hear that it does add up to something. Yeah, it started with the venue, which may or may not be surprising. And from the very, very, very earliest versions of the script, I always imagined Rufus living in the venue and having an office that overlooked it. And I always knew there was no way I was going to find the right place. And I was going to have to get rid of this idea of this like really cool sort of nest up above that he can kind of stare out over everything and also live up there and have this kind of multi-purpose space. And we ended up finding the place that we shot, which is the Highland Park Eval Club, which is in Highland Park in LA. And that was one of the first big things where I was like, okay, this is where everything starts to come together and where the actual physical space and all that stuff. And then from there on, it was just a matter of constantly communicating to every department head. I told everybody, like, I'm going to tell you what the DNA is, but your job is to sort of grow it from there because I can't make every single decision. So whether it's costumes or whatever, it was like, let's create an entire world from scratch, but let's make sure that at every point we're also doing it in a way that, I don't know, that's totally unified. And so it was a long journey, but at the same time, when you bring on great people, it happens quicker and more easily in some ways than you might expect. So anyway.
And then, Johnny, jumping off of the back of that, obviously the club is such a central part of the emotional fabric for your character as well. It's a place that his parents owned and ran, where he spent his entire childhood. And it also kind of keeps alive and keeps present that relationship with his parents on screen throughout the entire movie, even though they're not a physical presence in the film. So how did you want to construct his emotional connection to that space and really carry that through in your performance?
Well, it was it was a character and real life connection for me. I think, first off, as a black person in this country, when something's been in your family for 100 years, it has it's very, very, very special, very, very, very special. So I wanted to connect that to Rufus, but then also there's just something just very poignant about that journey as a character where you're inside this place, you're living in this place, your family has had it here, your music is here, your entire lives are connected to this place. And I think there's so many people in the country that can, relate to that. And I just wanted to borrow from that and inject it, poetically, into the performance.
Yeah. And then, Kevin, I wanted to jump to you next in terms of your character, Donnie, and his relationship with Rufus, because the friendship and the intimacy between them is so beautiful to watch. And you also find the humoristic elements, you find the physical space of how they're just very comfortable, even just laying on a couch really close to each other and touching. And so how did you really work with Johnny to shape so many of those details and so many elements into the history of their friendship?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was pretty much looking at Donnie as as like very separate from most of the characters in this movie, as being a very physical person and just kind of bouncing off the walls, and his energy kind of being to buoy Rufus. Like, I think honestly his opinion is that he doesn't really care if they keep it or if they sell it or whatever. It's just he wants to care about Rufus's happiness. So yeah, it was all about just kind of it being this like bright burning sun that is supplying energy, but also like frying him up, like just kind of being close and exploding right next to him at all times. He's kind of his own kind of creature in his own movie. So it was really fun and obviously Johnny's a lot of fun to play with. So we had a lot of fun just kind of getting right up in his face.
And Kate, similarly with your character, there's such a history that she has with Rufus as well, but there's obviously a very different dynamic. There's a lot of romanticism between the two of them, and there's this real sense that the two of them are just very magnetic with each other, and they tend to push together whenever they're around each other, but then they spend so much time apart, and you get the idea that they've been off and on ever since they've known each other over the decades. So how did you want to construct that emotional history between the two of them?
I think what was important for me was to construct my own kind of emotional history that she would have on her own, and then bring that to what Johnny had also worked on. I think that the cool thing about the relationship was that Jane was kind of the only character that he felt he could really be vulnerable with. Even with his sister, he felt like he had to put something on, like, I'm going to do this. It's going to be fine. Like, I got this. But he was keeping a lot from Jane, I think, throughout the movie because, I think he knew, sorry, my cat just jumped in my lap. There's Maeve, guys. There we go. I think that he was keeping things from her, but he knew that she could tell that there was something going on. And I think it was one of those things where he felt like as soon as she found out, he would have to honestly face all of this stuff. And so I think that in a lot of ways, her presence and their dynamic was to kind of make him come to terms truly with what was going on. And so, there's even a line where like Jane says, like, don't lie to me. Okay. Just like, don't. And I think that that's kind of like their dynamic just in general. And so, yeah, I think that was like a really special connection that those two characters had. And of course, yeah, it was just, Johnny and I can like joke and hang out and like, so it was easy.
And actually off the back of that for you, Johnny, there's a line for your character about how he behaves very differently when Kate's character Jane is around. And so were you thinking consciously about some of the different characteristics and traits and, vulnerabilities that he would show to her that maybe we don't see earlier in the film with some of the other characters?
All right, very much so. Very much so. I think you have to think about that with every character, with everybody you interact with. Everybody kind of shows a different version of themselves, with different people around different cultures and in different situations. And so when you have somebody that you have a magnetic connection with, that's going to bring certain things out of you. Sometimes people drink different liquors around different people. So, like I said, all that stuff was very conscious to me because the venue, even to go back to that, just represented family. And so everybody inside that family, all the different interactions and, connections and things like that were right there, under that roof.
And with that idea of family and intimacy and with everything that Isaiah was saying about having that singular location to film the majority of the movie within, how did that create a really different sense of intimacy on the set of filming this? And then how did that then parlay into the way that you're all working together, both in terms of acting and directing and collaborating on set?
I'll jump in with that. Oh, good. I think...
I was going to say this. We're going to say probably the same thing. That it was it was kind of like this little contained bubble in which, like, it felt like you were one of the characters who were living there. So it was that you didn't really go home, you didn't really go back to a trailer, you didn't go to a room. Between takes, we all just kind of hung out. Anybody who could play guitar or whatever had one around, so they were just kind of noodling around and we were just kind of joking around between. So there was a lot of that.
There were some like some real jam sessions and also some like real like beer drinking evenings that we filmed some of. But yeah, we definitely, like, Kevin and I actually lived a couple blocks away from the venue that we shot at. So we felt like we were just like hanging out at a local bar sometimes.
Yeah,
so,
if we weren't there, then we were just like a few blocks away.
Yeah.
And so if you were off, you're like, well, I might as well just be there. So like, like there was, I think that lends itself to a lot of creativity creativity and a lot of spontaneity, and that was what happened in a lot of those montage shots of the guy with the chicken head on a bike.
And Isaiah, from that mention that Kate was saying how you would film some of the moments that weren't even necessarily scene work, were there moments that we see within the film that really came out of that freedom and ability to just play around and pull out a camera in some of those casual moments with each other?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, it's funny. Even when I watch the movie, I sometimes have a hard time remembering exactly what was planned and what happened. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, there are certain things that probably didn't seem planned that were, and vice versa. But yeah, I mean, put it this way, there's a lot of the movie that ended up on the cutting room floor, and some of what ended up in it is stuff that I didn't expect. Like, again, the parties was a big thing. Because we were just having fun a ton. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie, though, which again is one of the things that ended up working out perfectly and totally seemed planned, was the Kevin and Kate playing their song, and that's one of my favorite parts. And I knew that I wanted them playing music and stuff like that, but the way it worked out was just like, hey, you guys, what if we learn this song? And I had this whole thing in mind. I think, Kate, you were like, well, we wrote a song one time, we should play that one. And I was like, let's do it. So there were certain things like
did not write it. Played it. He taught me how to play top string on bass, and we worked on it alone like a family band. And
there was some Partridge Family vibes.
There really were.
Yeah, a lot of no, this is A. No, I'm doing A. That's not A. Like, it was just a lot of
we almost got divorced because of that song, Isaiah. Okay.
Well, it's worth it.
And did that spontaneity that you were mentioning, did that really transcend into the way that you worked on a lot of the scenes on set as well? And how much of an opportunity did you have to really play around with scenes before you were filming them? Or because you had that central controlled environment, was it more kind of Isaiah pulling out the camera and just being able to play around on camera and figure things out?
Yeah, it was a mix. It was, again, there were certain moments where it was like, it has to happen exactly like this, because it was a subtly, that they're, put it this way, my aunt, who, you can always trust feedback from your aunt, and she loved it. So, obviously that just, the movie's great. But she was like, I really liked how there were a lot of times where they were talking about something that wasn't the thing that they really wanted to be talking about. And so there were a lot of times where I think we would talk through the scene as it was written and realize, like, okay, we don't necessarily need to rewrite or improvise in the sense that it's like, it's not funny enough or it's this, but like, let's obscure the feelings a little bit more. Let's shove down what's actually being experienced so that we can hide it a little bit, because that's what these characters are doing. Like, they're drinking it, they're trying to do all that. And so that led to a lot of like spontaneity, because it was like, we don't have to do tons of exposition. There aren't a ton of times where it has to be said exactly like this. There are some of those, but not a ton. So that's at least how I felt when we were working on it. I'm curious if you guys felt the same, or if that was more of it.
I think that's a tough thing about movies, because movies are always trying to balance this idea of showing, a depiction of real life in some sense, but then also you have the exposition of the story that you have to get out. And sometimes those things can clash together. And that's one of the things I love about this movie, because it showcases, a lot of those real life spontaneous moments where you have this big problem you need to solve. And a lot of times in real life, people don't really solve that problem. They don't go to therapy. They don't talk about it with their friends. They don't read a self-help book. They don't do any of those things. They go get drunk. They hang out with their friends, and then time passes. And then, at some odd time you're not expecting, you're really faced with the choice or the decision of, wait, how am I going to do this? And that could be a year later, 5 years later, or 10 years later, as we all probably know with certain things in our lives. And so that is where I think a lot of the drama and the comedy came, from the script, us playing around with each other, having conversations before scenes, after scenes. And, and I think it led to this very loose but also tight dynamic between us all.
And for you, Johnny, Kate, and Kevin, with what Isaiah was just saying about, his aunt pointing out how much of the film was characters not saying what they're actually saying, you know, and there is so much subtext in it. Did you find that it was kind of like an interesting journey as an actor in figuring out your performance elements and looking at the script and really working in depth on what a lot of the subtext was within each of the scenes and each of the conversations?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of, I know for me personally, I find like that kind of subtlety to be really appealing. I like the challenge of that. I like the idea of showing somebody who's in pain, who's laughing, who is, is trying to pretend like that's not happening. Or just like for whatever reason, it brought up that there was a line where Johnny and I are drinking, our characters are drinking in the bar, and Jane kind of just like slides in like, I'm fine, by the way, because she recently, her father died, and it's, and so it's like he's so wrapped up in his own thing, and he's so wrapped up in their will they won't they dynamic, that he kind of forgets that she's going through something as well. And so it was like, for me, having that's such a heavy line, and it's said in such a flippant, fine, by the way, kind of way, that it really, to me, like something like that can be so powerful and such a powerful moment to wield as an actor, I think, because it is like, there can't be a heavier, more subtext filled thing than that. So I found that kind of thing to be really fun, that kind of balance.
And Johnny, I also wanted to talk about Rufus's relationship on screen with his sister, because there's such a dichotomy between the relationship that they have to the club, what they think should happen with it. They both have the same shared history, and yet they're both on completely different journeys and paths in their lives. And because of that, there's a real sense of isolation that it seems like Rufus feels from her at certain points. So how did you want that to inform the sibling dynamic between the two of them as they're kind of butting heads a little bit at trying to figure all of this out?
Yeah, it's crazy because while we were filming this, I was going through something very similar. Well, not me specifically, but my mom, because my grandma passed away, and so there was this conversation about what to do with the house. And you see all these different perspectives, all these different wants, needs, all these different agendas. Again, in our communities, a house means something so important. So do we sell it and let them come in and take over this place? So I love the tagline, like, about selling out, because that's a conversation that so many of us have in so many, different ways. So being able to see that conversation from afar, and, I'm not Will Smith. I wasn't like, well, guess what? I'll roll up in here and buy the house and everything's solved. Like this, you know what I'm saying? Like, it couldn't be that thing. You kind of watch from afar and you're like, wow, the best thing I can do is kind of infuse this into the art and all the, the tragic and the beautifully tragic ways that, this, comes to be. And I think much credit to Isaiah and one of the themes that he was going for is like, a lot of times things don't work out. There is not, when I describe the movie to people, a lot of times they're like, well, so he's going to save it at the end, right? And I'm like,
Spoiler alert.
You got to watch it. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that was a very poignant thing for me, at the time, because I was seeing it happen firsthand. So, I, chatted with Vicky, and, we had conversations about how we could, bring that to life on camera.
Yeah. And off the back of that, for all of you, the film really does have such an interesting conversation about what does it mean to be creative? What does success mean in terms of what you individually consider success, but also the way that other people perceive certain things as well. We see the way that Rufus sees his ex-bandmate and thinks that he sold out, his idea of what Jane's success is. And so there's all these different dichotomies and versions of what that looks like, both to individuals and externally. And so I just wanted to ask all of you a little bit about how you all wanted to explore that conversation and theme throughout the film.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for me, the thing that was the most poignant was, this industry that we're all in can be so difficult, and you feel like you're kind of trudging up a hill for so long, and that you're aiming for this specific goal. And then you realize sometimes that when you get to that goal and you get that thing that you were running after, that it does not fill that hole. It does not fix the issues. It doesn't, in fact, sometimes it feels more like a burden than a victory. And I think that was like, for me, Jane, she did it. She went out and she went on tour, and she was making money, and she was living off of just being a musician. And she was like, and then I realized like people are sleeping in their cars. Like, it's like, it's not the thing that you think it is. And so even when you kind of, even when you can achieve that thing that you're going after so hard, sometimes the achieving of it is actually the exciting part, and that the actual achievement feels a little hollow. And I think that that's part of the reason Jane came back, is that she realized that she needed deeper connections. There was more for her than just these little achievements. And I think that that's the thing that she's realized that Rufus has yet to realize, but he's on that same track. So I think she's kind of like waiting for him to kind of meet her there, in that, in the importance that they have with each other. Yeah.
I think the Tyler stuff was really interesting to me, very true, in that, creative people are very good at creating imaginary enemies. There's so many times in which you have a chip on your shoulder because there's this one person you've created in your mind who's a rival, or who you are in competition with, or several people, or the world, whatever. But it's just a manifestation of your own doubt and your own insecurity and frustration and unhappiness. So when you encounter it face to face, you realize that this person hasn't done anything to you. What's even worse, they haven't even really thought about you all that much. Mm-hmm. So really, like, it just kind of is super deflating to Rufus, and it's something that I think about too, because I always have someone, or something that's spurring me on or whatever. It's like that, not to compare myself to Michael Jordan, but I took that personally thing. I think that that's so true, that everybody, you sometimes you have to create that thing in your head, but it's, as long as you know that that's not real, mm-hmm. then okay. But creative people also aren't that same anyway. So
it's true.
And Isaiah, for you, how did that feed into the way that you shaped all of these characters? Because it's a conversation and a journey that you really have so many of the characters in this film carrying through, exactly to Kate's point.
Yeah, it was a very personal journey, because the seed of the script was this weird combination of like very practical things. Like, I love music. I love the idea of a venue story that doesn't end the way you expect. And I love all these other things. And then me, I think at first subconsciously and then very consciously trying to process letting go of the first business I ever started, which was a creative agency, and getting to that point where like I had achieved this level of success sooner and higher than I had expected. I had all these employees and all this stuff, and I was so miserable. Like, I was, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, you must be so happy. Like, this is so cool. And I was like, well, I'm in a lot of debt and I'm exhausted and I hate the work I do. And I started to lose it. And so in a lot of ways it was a different situation from Rufus, but in some ways it was similar. And so to me, it was kind of that moment where I was like, who am I trying to save? I'm trying to save all these other people, and I'm trying to fix all these other situations, and I'm trying to put all the problems out there, when in reality, like 99% of the shit I'm dealing with is here. And it took me much longer than making Rollers to actually realize that on a really like embodied level. I think I was, even by making Rollers, I was like, oh, I've figured this out. And then through the process of getting my butt kicked by making the movie, which is always going to do that, then I was like, oh no, you were like still more in this than you realized. So I don't know, in some ways, I don't know if that really answers it, but yeah, it kind of came out very naturally over the course of the process.
Yeah. And Johnny, talking about your character Rufus, there's, kind of going back to that idea of all the subtext within the characters, there's so much and so many elements with your character. So when you first got this role and started working with the scripts, what was your journey of really figuring out all of the elements that were underneath this character and really working beyond the pages of the script that you had from Isaiah, the conversations that you were able to have with him to really flesh him out and add so many layers and dimension to your performance?
Oh, she's trying to get into my process. Okay. But no, seriously, for me, it's reading the script a bunch of times and then kind of just going into your personal bag is what I like to call it. And those are the experiences that happen to you. Like I said, the stuff that happened with my grandmother, the things that are may not be on the nose on the project, but culturally, the diaspora is very important to me. So that's how I connect to 100 years. My family is very important to me. Having a family be able to, be under the same roof. That's how most Americans are living. It's not this, what Hollywood is most of the time. Somebody goes on a trip and they got a penthouse in Vegas. No, people got to stay at the Luxor or a few miles, down the road. You understand what I'm saying? So for me, like I can relate to those very real, nuanced details. Before my grandmother passed, there was like 10 people living in our house, all different generations, all different people with different aspirations and different philosophies on life. And you have to figure. And so upstairs in the attic feels like one thing, the main floor feels like something else, and then people staying in the basement feels like something else. So for me, it's just using my life, using other great performances, using poetry, and like I said, using the common human experience to just try to tap in and then say, all right, hey, I want to say this in this scene. But like Kate said, we drinking beers. So, we got to cover that up a little bit and, have some fun that way. But, as the great ones do, as we all try to do, you speak from here, in those scenes. So that's just kind of how I roll a little bit.
Yeah. And we touched upon it a little bit earlier, but would be remiss not to talk a little bit more about the music in the film, because it's so much within the fabric, but also it's so much of the emotional connectivity to a lot of characters and a lot of moments and a lot of the tone and voice of the film overall. And so I wanted to ask you all about how those scenes would come together in a way that it really had that emotional connectivity and the intimacy that you wanted to draw us all into.
Let me just shout out Earl Thomas. Like I just have to do that. Like his voice is kind of the subtextual layer of the movie. His voice reminds me of listening to those soulful spirituals that people used to sing. So I can't think about this movie and not think about him and what him and his voice and his tonality contributed. So like that was another thing that really drew me into the project, because even though there's these pretty colors and we got funny jokes and big notebooks and all this stuff, there's kind of this thing like, Earl Thomas, I think, grounded us, because I know that I was able to listen to some of his work and see him, very early on in the process. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, especially in early cuts, I think people thought was kind of a gimmick, and I was like, it's sort of important. And it was one of those things that came up at the last minute, but John, who plays the guy with no arms or no hands, I had him cast as this homeless guy who uses Rufus's shower. And then on the day, it was actually our very last day of filming, he was like, I could play the piano, by the way. And I was like, oh, okay, like, let's do it. And that ended up becoming, this moment where it was like music for him was so healing. Like the song he plays, he actually wrote for his wife who had passed away. So it was almost like this eulogy. And I was like, that to me captures the whole thing. Like, here's a guy who, by all accounts, should have given up on music, and he's like, no, music isn't about that. It's about right here. And so for me, it really captured the whole thing, which is, a lot of people, when they read the script, they're like, why doesn't Rufus play? And I'm like, because he can't. Like, that's the whole thing. Like, he's cut off from that part of himself. And so anyway, I think that like the presence of music and the lack of music, not just even the tone, although that's really important, was always a really important dynamic that I was working on. So,
I'd also like to mention that Rollers has a Spotify playlist, and I listen to it all the time. It's such a good playlist. So just like find it and listen to it. It's excellent.
Amazing. And then lastly, for each of you individually, I just wanted to ask you about what it was in making this film that really challenged you the most within your craft. And I'm going to come to you first, Kate.
Oh, goodness, me first. Okay. I would say that the thing that kind of challenged me the most was really allowing those kind of vulnerable moments to unfold. I think that I naturally in my real life, and also I feel like Jane does this as well, is that she wants to fill the silence with something. You can't stand the great abyss, and you're worried about what's going to come through. And so I think I think partly for her, that's music. I think it's like needing sound, needing something. And I think that that's what it was with, Rufus, is that they're hanging out, and instead of just sitting there across from him, she's like, no, let's dance. Let's and I think it's about, for me, it was a challenge of finding those moments to really sit silently in that kind of like the reality of that. I feel like the scene at the end with her and Rufus in the hospital room, and there's this really kind of heavy moment of silence. And for me, like that kind of encompasses just the challenge of being a person, of being able to sit with another person in silence and have that mean something. So for me, that was a kind of a challenge, an exciting challenge. Yeah. Also, by the way, learning bass and playing, and then getting up on stage and pretending to play the drums and all of that stuff. I'd say that was also a challenge, which you can see from my face in the movie.
And Kevin?
I'd say that we did a lot of takes that that began as masters, but then ended up as kind of like almost like these not necessarily oneers, because we would cut here and there, but like they felt very much like being in a play. So you kind of, when you look at them, they're flat in a good way, that it's just kind of like this little tableau that you're entering and exiting. In some cases you leave and you come back. So it was interesting to like do this thing at times that felt like a hybrid of the two, and what was really great is like right after that, we'd be like, is this working? It was kind of like, multicam that way, that you just are like rewriting on the fly. Like, we were like, what about this is working? What about it isn't? And we would just kind of tinker. So it felt like you kind of forgot what you were doing at times, which was super cool.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, I thought that was a really unique experience, and it kind of adds a different texture to everything.
Yeah. And Johnny?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It did kind of feel like we had our feet in different, styles, whether that be multicam, whether that be theater, whether that be single cam. And I think for me, just right off the rip, when we first started working on the project, it was the looseness of the project that, I had to find my footing with. I come from very, like, some of the stuff I've done before, Rectify and Brain Dead, even though Brain Dead was a comedy in a bit, like you're sitting there with the producers and they said, we want this, like we in Rectify, that is not something that ain't no looseness to it. They have a very specific emotional arc, and you say the lines that's on the page, et cetera, et cetera. So with this, like, I was like, there would be times when me and Isaiah would be talking. I'm like, what you want, man? Like, what do you want? He'd be like, I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out.
Find it.
And I'm like, okay, well, shit. Okay. And then once you get into that rhythm, you understand what I'm saying, and figuring that out and saying, okay, well, we might change this whole scene, like right now before we do, it was one thing, but we're going to change it, and trying to alter my process to be able to accomplish that. That was fun. That was challenging. And I think it produces, fantastic results. And I think it's just, as an artist, it's always great to be a part of different processes. Isaiah's a different kind of director than I've ever, worked with before. And that's a beautiful fucking thing. Beautiful thing. So, I cherish the experience, but once we figured it out, once we all started speaking the same language, we was like, oh, okay, we cooking with gas. Let's rock out with our things out. You know what I'm saying?
And then Isaiah?
Yeah, in a similar way, just from a different perspective, I think I'll give the honest answer that makes me nervous, which is that, like, I needed to say more often what I wanted, because the truth is I did know a lot of the times, and I didn't trust myself at times to say it. And it led to, I think, some really, really interesting evolutions. And so it worked out great. But there were other times where, like, I did realize, like, damn, like, you gotta, like, give people something to, like, really sink their teeth into. And I think that was the first couple of days were a little too loosey-goosey. And then I think that's when we really started to find a groove, was when I was like, okay, if I know I want this, I'm going to tell you guys, this is exactly what I want. And if I really know I don't want this, then that is where we can play. But if we play all the time, then we don't have a movie anymore. And so that was a huge on the fly learning curve for me, going from, shooting 3 days at a time when I make shorts or whatever, to like, no, we gotta figure this out for 20 straight days. And like, we're shooting way out of order, all this kind of stuff. So thankfully, like, everybody was really honest with me too. And it was like, you guys all said that at times, like, yo, like, don't pretend with me, so I think I had to learn that, and thankfully, like, we were able to communicate really well, so that, again, there was enough room to play. And the same is true in the edit. I mean, it evolved so much of the course of the project, because movies are, they're alive in a weird way, not to be cliche. It decided this movie wanted to be something that was kind of unexpected to me. So it was that balance, which I think I finally sort of have started to realize, like, okay, cool. That was the biggest learning experience that you needed to do. And so I'm glad you asked about that.
Well, I really want to thank all of you for sharing so much about the making of the film. Thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you. Go watch the movie, y'all. Amazon, iTunes, DirecTV, all the other kinds of TVs, all the other kind of VODs on your phone, iPad, all that.
Just go over to Johnny's house and he'll play it for you.
Yeah.
Just basically, that's what he's saying. Just
Just
go
come
over, he'll make you popcorn. It's going to be a whole thing.
He's got all of those.
Seriously, don't even tell him. Just show up, ring his doorbell. He'll be ready for you.